Okay, so let's get into where they meet. So the process from the first anthology to now your journey, understanding this craft, working this craft, trying to figure out like how best to do this. Where was the manuscript for where they meet born, and where did you not where how did you think about organizing all of these poems into a cohesive manuscript?
War is such an inherently poetic concept, I think, because a lot of poems are about war. There's different kinds of feelings, different kinds of smells, emotions, all that stuff that it's just inherently poetic. So a lot of the songs are about war, but then as a husband and a father, being a husband and father is also inherently poetic. And I found a lot of my writing was centering on the emotions of being a father or loving a woman for, umpteen years. And those things were very far apart from the poems about war. But sometimes those two things clash together as far as you bring those experiences of war home to your family. And how does that affect your family? Well, that's where they meet.
Is that much of it? That's not much of a change for you, right?
My name is Carey Kight. I used to load bombs in the Air Force, and now I'm a writer, a filmmaker, and an entrepreneur. Through using the post-9/11 GI Bill to go to college, working hourly jobs to pay the bills, and freelancing my way into a career, I've studied what it takes to successfully transition from service to civilian, and that study has become a conversation. On this podcast, I speak to other veterans, successful artists, and entrepreneurs about their transition, what they did well, where they failed, what they learned, and most importantly, how they applied their skills.
Episode 121 features Nate Coffey, a National Guardsman, poet, and author of Where They Meet, a collection of poetry published by Dead Reckoning Collective.
Welcome. This is Veteran Made.
This episode is brought to you by Go Pills, a nootropic that gives your brain neurotransmitter support both acutely and over time. Those of us that served in the military, regardless of where we served and in what capacity we served, all came into contact with different chemicals, different percussions, and various elements of our environments that have affected our brain's ability to function. Think about your brain's performance and your mental health right now, yes, but think about your future too. We have so much more control over our long-term health than we realize. Visit gopills.com and use code VM15 at checkout for 15% off. That's VM15 for 15% off. Give your brain the neurotransmitter support it needs to perform well right now and over time. All right. Good fall morning from the Midwest, the great state of Ohio for me, great state of Indiana for you. Cokie, welcome to Veteran Made.
Howdy.
Good to have you this morning, brother. For those who don't know who you are, would give us if you could just give us a brief primer on who you are and where and when you've served, and then we'll jump into some questions about where they meet.
So what they might have heard from me is my writing. So the Where They Meet book was a Dead Reckoning Collective book. If you never read any of those books, then I highly recommend your viewers go over to Dead Reckoning Collective and start picking up some stuff. They published my first book. They're looking at my second one currently. So wait and see when that comes out. But so I started out, like most military veterans, I started out at went to Bible college, got a degree as a pastor. It's gonna be a chaplain. So I got a degree as a preaching minister, and so I was getting ready to go into the chaplaincy, and then I thought, well, maybe I better get the enlisted experience first. So we're better to do that than the Marine Corps infantry. So this is the pipeline. I went to the Marine Corps in 2003, and then I got into the sniper platoon after that, and said this is way easier than being a pastor. So I stayed as a sniper for about 8 years, and got out in 2011, switched over to private military contracting, National Guard stuff, and I've been a medic for a while, did private military contracting for some other, some various companies. And that's kind of where I landed for now.
I love it. I'm a pastor's kid. My dad passed away earlier this year, but 30 some years ago, right when I was born, and just after, he was a pastor, and then he made the transition to entrepreneurship, but still was like a teaching elder at the churches that we went to. So I spent a lot of times sitting and listening to him teach and minister kind of throughout my life, like mostly throughout my childhood. So we definitely have a connection there. I'd love to start there. It's interesting. Why did you say you wanted to start with the enlisted experience? Were you initially looking to kind of figure out who it was that you would have been ministering to in the Corps? What was that transition like for you from that education jumping into the enlisted world?
Yeah, so I was going through a lot of theology classes and a lot of Bible classes and things like that, and then I understood that it would be hard to minister to somebody who's been in the infantry, which is where I wanted. That's where I wanted to minister. If you've never been where they've been, so I decided I wanted to go that route, and so I ended up enlisted, and then I just kind of never switched back over. Just to get that experience, chewing the dirt for a bit, getting shot at, and all that good stuff, and just kind of hung out there for a while.
I mean, it makes sense, right? Like, I think there's, not to paint with too broad of a brush for chaplains in the military or pastors at large in the church, but it is that is a unique thought process or experience, right? To know, all right, if I'm going to minister to or coach or mentor or teach, right, to make it more broad for those who don't have a religious background, it's important to have that experience, right? Like, you look at coaches in the NFL, right? Coaches who have played, even if they didn't play at the highest level or play well at the highest level, a lot of those coaches that have played and understand from the player's perspective what they're going through on a weekly basis, practicing and training and going through walkthroughs and then getting ready for the game and kind of having that experience that they understand from a different angle than somebody who's just been coaching the entire time, right?
Yeah, correct. And that's not to say that a pastor who's never been, a drug addict can't minister to drug addicts. I have a huge amount of respect for pastors, especially my own. My dad was a pastor, so they go through a lot, and they don't have to have gone through those lifestyles in order to minister to that. But there are certain things that there are certain groups of people that you can't really. It's hard to talk to about certain things or say certain things if you've never been there. So if you walk up to a guy that's never been in the infantry or whatever, and you talk to him about courage, like he's like, yeah, okay, dude, what do you know about that? Rightly or wrongly, whatever you may be saying may be right, but it's easier to have that in if you've already been shot at or whatever and had to deal with that kind of thing.
Right. I think that's right. That makes sense. When did writing start for you? Is it something that you'd done as a kid and kept going with? Is it something you fell into? How did that start for you?
I took a lot of, creative writing classes in college, just those filler classes, and kind of, thoroughly enjoyed them. I didn't really start writing a whole lot when I was in the military too much. But it was the process when I got out of the Marine Corps, and then I did contracting for a bit, and then I left it for a while. So I went from Marine Corps, the doing combat deployments and things like that, went straight into contracting. So it wasn't really much of a transition. I just got more money, still doing the job, but I got out of that the first time so that I could come home and spend time with my wife and kids. One of my, kids was born while I was in Baghdad. So I was like, okay, well, I think I'm done for a while. And I came home and I got a job in a factory, which was just such a divorce from where I had been. And I was really having a hard time processing, and I was having a hard time acting like a normal human being. I was acting like the chest thumping veteran quite a bit. And so I was just in an effort to process, I started, putting pen to paper. I was doing things like, I think I first got my start writing in the Havoc Journal. I've got a few articles there. And then I went over to some of your viewers might know OAF Nation. They really hooked me up, especially a guy named David Rose. I don't know if you ever heard of him. I'm sorry.
I'm reading Screaming Eagles right now, and he'll be on in a few episodes. So, yep, that one right there.
Yep,
got it.
So he really hooked me up, and then that's where I kind of got my start, just kind of like pontificating on veteran stuff, and then eventually David hit me up and he said, hey man, there's these Dead Reckoning fellas. They're looking to put together a poetry book. Have you ever done that? I was like, no, not even a little bit. So I started working on poetry and things like that. Kind of figured out that I enjoyed it, and then I got some of my work published in their first anthology, the Dead Reckoning anthology, and just kept going. I was back into contracting at that point. I was on deployment, so I had a lot of free time. So I spent a lot of time writing poetry, just kind of experimenting with it, and that's where my first book came from, the Were They Me book.
So I want to get there, but before we go there, I want to ask you about what made you pick up a pen and put it to paper while you were working in a factory. What was it about writing that was how you wanted to kind of make sense and make meaning and process your experiences as that chest thumping veteran, as you said?
Just trying to understand what I went through, and then understand how best to translate that to the real world. For some reason, writing things down, I was able to absorb them or process them better. And a lot of people aren't like that. A lot of people just have to talk about it, or maybe they're artsy or whatever, and they can draw pictures of that stuff. But just kind of putting that experience from your brain into paper, like, really helped me to process. Like, oh, okay, here's where we're going with this.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? There's a lot of my favorite thing about the Dead Reckoning community is that there's a lot of us who write, and within that community, it's like very raw, right? Like we didn't start as necessarily as trained writers. There's a few that have, right? There's a few that have those degrees and have been pursuing that since childhood or since like early in the military as an actual kind of actualized desire, right? Like I want to write, I want to put it down. But a lot of us have started with, well, I don't really know what else to do. I'm not a verbal processor. I'm not a painter, right? I'm not a performer. So kind of like what's left? Well, I take notes on my phone, or I've journaled through my deployments, or I've, kind of done that in some unofficial capacity. And now here I find myself doing it in a little bit more official capacity. So what was that process like for you to go from that kind of raw, I'm just trying to make sense of all of this, to that journey of like, well, let me put a manuscript together that brings it all cohesively together?
So I'm not sure if this really answers your question, but I think that there was a book that I read called Tattoo Zoo by Paul Avallone. If you've never heard of it, it's a novel about Afghanistan by a guy who's a former Green Beret, became a correspondent, and he wrote a book that was about a fictional firefight, or a fictional like battle essentially in Afghanistan, by a regular line company. So just infantry guys. There's a special forces guy that makes an appearance, but it's not like your typical soft special operations like loving book. And it really nailed down the experience of the infantry guy that's just, on the ground. Not doing anything particularly cool. He just kind of gets stuck in places and has to deal with it. And he was able to really vocalize a lot of the feelings and the experience of war, and some of the really minute portions. Like there's someone in his book that just watches his very good friend die in a very horrific way, and is replaying it in his head, and he's dealing with it and cleaning the stuff off of his gear, and he was able to really nail down the emotion of it. And it's like, well, I wonder if I could do that. So I wrote a short story at one point just for myself about a guy that was dealing with coming back to the States and being with his family and stuff, and then still stuck over there and dealing with all that. Just to see if I can nail down the emotion of it. So the feelings that we were feeling, I was trying to see if I could vocalize that a little bit, and then that led into A Way of Nation, like trying to say, hey, what are we thinking about this? Okay, let's play those thoughts out, or hey, let's look at the infantry, the basic infantry guy, and I've got a piece at A Way of Nation called "For the Love of Grunts" or something like that, or I'm speaking as a medic. as a National Guard medic, looking at these infantry guys, now that I'm not an infantry guy, looking at these infantry guys and saying like how great your basic infantry, 0311, 0331, machine gunner, or an 11 Bravo, or an 11 Charlie in the Army, how great those guys are. They're just salt of the earth, good dudes, strong people. And then, how much you want to help them when they're doing their job.
Yeah, OAF Nation and Havoc do a great job of providing a very granular perspective, from that enlisted point of view, right? Like, and not one that's hyper political, not one that's hyper cultural, not one that is hero worshiping. It's just this idea of like, okay, who's there, who's around, who's observing, who's participating, and how can we get that perspective and get it out there to kind of help bridge that military civilian divide so that people can really understand from the various perspectives on the ground.
Yeah, they do a really good job.
Okay, so poetry, right? Like, so poetry is interesting for me. I never wrote poetry. The first poem, I wrote some poems in grade school, right? Like as assignments and things like that. But I actually never took poetry classes in high school, never took poetry classes in college, even though I got a writing degree. I was focused mostly on screenwriting and prose and nonfiction and things like that, personal essay. The first like real poem I wrote was as a part of a Dead Reckoning collective course. I think it was called On Parenting or Writing as a Parent or something like that. And my wife and I took the course around the Zoom for a few hours and wrote a poem. Actually, it was pretty fun because the way that Keith and Jessica did it is they assigned the poem and everybody took their time to write it. And it turns out my wife and I wrote about the exact same day, and we each wrote about it from our own perspectives, and we hadn't actually talked to each other about it. And it was interesting because then we volunteered to present the poems to the not the class, but to the everybody else on the Zoom. And it was a really fascinating experience for me, and definitely unlocked a little bit more of a muscle that I didn't even realize that I had, and I did not even realize that I was interested in continuing to exercise. And then I wrote one and submitted for the third anthology, yet to hear back, if that's going to make it into the third anthology for Dead Reckoning. But even if I didn't, like, I really enjoyed the process of exercising that muscle. And now I've found myself writing poetry on the side, not even necessarily for publication, but just for my own kind of interest and my own processing, and continuing to exercise that writing muscle. So when David asked you about that first anthology and you decided to put pen to paper as a poem, what was that process like for you to go from that personal essay to poetry?
So enough cannot be said about David Rose and Leo Jenkins and Justin Egan. Those guys really started the as far as I know, they're the ones that I saw first do this poetry thing. And they went on tour reading their poems, just, three hardened veterans from pretty intense backgrounds that went around just reading poetry. And I was like, I didn't know you could do that. Not only write poetry, but go on reading it. And so they really started this, as far as I know. There might be someone else that did it before they did, but as far as I know, those guys, you can't say enough about them. You cannot say enough about Dead Reckoning, who is not only absorbing these guys and publishing their work, but also training people with classes. It's just they're doing fantastic work. But so when I did it, the only thing that I really knew was the free verse stuff, because free verse is when you first start out can be the easiest, because you're just kind of like you're just vomiting words onto paper, and then you hit enter a few times and then make it look like a stanza or make it look something more creative or something. So that's kind of what I knew. But then I started looking at some of the older poets, like George Gordon, Lord Byron. He's got a group of poems or a book of poems called Hebrew Songs or something like that, where despite the fact that he's not really, I don't think he's really much of a believer in the Bible, was writing biblical stories in the form of poetry. And he's got a poem that I can't remember. It's about the siege by Sennacherib. It's in the Bible. It's in the Old Testament. And I didn't know about it until I watched a show called Archer. You ever heard of Archer?
No. Oh, the FX show?
Cartoon, yeah. It's this cartoon.
Okay,
It's
yeah.
a ridiculous, absolutely preposterous cartoon. And there's
Yes,
one
right.
character, the real big blonde lady. I can't remember her name anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
Pam or something. Yeah. So she's got this poem that's tattooed on her back. And at one point I hit pause and I looked at it. I was like, that's really cool. And then I looked at it. It was a George Gordon Lord Byron poem about that particular story in the Bible. And I found out that he was using a device where he changed the rhythm of the poem to where it was a trochaic. And you heard of iambic pentameter. There's trochaic, where iambic, it would be like a 4/4 time or a 2/4 time. Da 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 da. She walks in beauty like the night. That would be another George Gordon Lord Byron poem. But that would be the iambic. Trochaic is a 3/4 or a 6/8 if you're a musician. So he changed the poetry to that because he felt that the 6/8 has a more of a speedy form, and it makes the mind think of galloping horses charging into battle. And so when I figured out that you could do that with the rhythm of the poem, I was like, well, let me try that. And I started, playing around with rhythms. And so that's when I started doing, trochaic, iambic, and then I would sometimes switch in the middle of a poem to get a certain feel. I didn't know, didn't really know I could do that. But then once I actually tried it, then that turned into, actual rhyme, verse, meter, and then exploring that as a medium.
As somebody without a background in poetry, I think I might know the answer to this question, but what made you dive in that deeply into what kind of poetry you could write? Because I think you're right. Free verse, a lot of folks start with that and maybe even just stay there because, especially for veterans, right? It's or not even veterans, but people who are unpacking kind of things that they've done, things they've wanted to do, things they haven't done, things that have happened or could have happened. Free verse is the best way to do that, right? You can just go, and if it works, it works. If it flows, it flows. If it doesn't, it doesn't, and you just keep kind of tweaking and figuring it out. What made you dive that deep into the options available to you?
I don't know. I don't have any training in poetry. I just have Mrs. Davis's high school, class back in Hamilton Heights High School in the 90s.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what made me decide to delve into that. I think I saw some of the greater poets. I've been reading them for quite a while, and really, I wonder how they did that. So reading will make you a better writer, and reading poetry will make you a better poet. So just trying to figure out how they did that and seeing if I was able to do that on some level. Obviously, I'm not going to be a George Gordon Lord Byron or a good grief a G.K. Chesterton or something, but I can look at what they did and become inspired by it.
One thing that we explore a lot on the podcast is the ratio between creation and consumption, right? Like how much consumption is necessary, how much consumption is helpful, and how much consumption might be too much, right? Like I found myself early in my writing career right now. I predominantly write commercial right now that I work in marketing and advertising and production and things like that. I found myself getting trapped in too much consumption early, and I've been working to integrate that ratio to have the right amount of consumption so that I can understand and observe like you're describing, but then also be inspired isn't the right word, but get enough momentum to then do my own creation and kind of volley it back and forth. What's the ratio like for you now that you've been writing more poetry? Is your second book going to be poetry?
Yes.
Yeah. So now that you've published one, you're publishing another. What's that ratio like for you now, and how do you look at it?
So it was about 1-to-1. This is probably not the right answer, but it was about 1-to-1 when I was really seriously writing. So my process was I would listen to, because I drive a lot for work, and I spend a couple hours on the road a day, and so I'd be listening to something that I would pick a poet, and a lot of my newer stuff is I was listening to G.K. Chesterton quite a bit, so he's by far my favorite poet. If you ever read Ballad of the White Horse, it's
Mm-hmm.
epic poem about Alfred the Great and his fighting the Danes. So I would get into that, and I would be like, oh yeah, and I'm driving like, and then I would okay, well let me see if I can replicate that that feeling or whatever it was, or I would he'd have like some sort of rhythm or meter that I'd never heard before, and it worked really well. So I would say, well, okay, I wonder if I could do that. So then I would sit there, driving obviously, and I would say, well, what can I write about? And I would think of a topic, and then I would just play around with it, and then I would notes on my phone, just speaking into my phone while I'm driving, because otherwise I would die if I was typing. Yeah. I would just put something down on there, and then I would continue to play with it until it got to be something that either I decided would work, or for a vast majority, then I would just throw them away. Like, hey, there's nothing there, and I would just get rid of it. So it was 1-to-1 for a while. Yeah, you got to read quite a bit. I would say minimum 2-to-1. You got to read a lot. But you're right when
What's the ratio?
you talk about your process. Like you nailed it on the head when you talked about it's a muscle. Earlier when you talked about I didn't know I had that muscle. So yeah, it's something that as you it's like any kind of weight training or something. As you progress in it, you're going to continue it and do it more and do it more, and then throw more weight on there. So yeah, that process is it's exactly like a muscle. Like your brain's got those little pathways or whatever that, the brain wranglers are able to talk about. It's got those pathways where once you start doing something in a process, you get better at it, and then you're able to do it more and more and more.
Yeah. And it's funny where that inspiration hits you. I was reading, read to my daughter at night, and I read to her in the mornings as well. And I was reading a children's Christmas book to her this morning. We start Christmas right after Halloween in our house. Now that I've become a dad, I'm like, the 4 weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas isn't enough Christmas spirit. So we've moved it up to the day after Halloween, November 1st. We've got all of our stuff up, and we're watching Christmas movies and reading Christmas books. So I was reading.
Correct. This is the right answer. This is the way.
Yes. This is the way. That's exactly right. And so I was reading a bunch of Christmas books to her this morning, and I was reading one, and it gave me a little bit of an idea for something that I haven't started writing yet, but it kind of it planted this seed for me. Oh, that's an interesting story. So I read that to her, and then I read her 2 more books. Then I made her breakfast, and I'm reading her another book, and that idea was in the back of my head, and it was that seed was kind of planted. And so then I got halfway through Frosty the Snowman, of all things, and a few sentences hit me. And so I said, baby, hold on one second. And I got my phone out, and I did the talk to text on the notes, and I just spit out like 3 sentences. And they weren't very good, but there was enough for me to go back to, right? Whenever I'm ready. And she looked at me, she said, what are you doing? I said, well, I have an idea for a story, and the stories that I've been reading you have kind of helped me figure out that this might be a story. I don't know if it's going to be yet, but I just wanted to get those 3 sentences out so I don't forget them. And she said, okay. And she's like, I don't care. Keeps eating her bagel, and I keep reading the book. And now I've got that note, and I'll probably go back to it all day today and just kind of tinker with it and see if there's something there. And if there's something there, I'll put it on a larger document and then keep it going. And if there isn't, there isn't. But I was exercising that muscle. And so even if it doesn't lead to anything, it was still exercise. It was still a rep.
Yeah. And I think that reading to your kids, that's something that my mom did to me and my brother quite a bit. So she would read to us C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of Narnia. She read to us Lord of the Rings, like she would read to us the Uncle Tom's Cabin, like classics. Just to we didn't really understand what they were all the time, but that developed our love of reading, so that we turned into bookworms growing up as kids. And then reading to your kids is great. But when you talk about that seed or whatever that's in your mind, it's like a splinter in your mind, like they say in the Matrix. That's a great analogy, because I think when we stop at free verse when we're writing poetry, I think it's because we think we can't do anything else. So we've reduced artistry and writing to mere self-expression. So if I'm able to express myself to the point where I understand it, then that is art, and that leads to all kinds of weirdness. And I happen to believe that there is such thing as objective beauty and objective truth. if there's one, there is the other, So why don't we try to make art and writing more than just vomiting on paper? So when we write like a free verse thing, they do exactly what you did. Like, hey, maybe this is okay as like a self-expression thing. I know what I'm trying to say, but maybe I can refine it as a craft. Maybe I can turn it into something that is more accessible to the reader. So I think that when we kind of hover at just self-expression, you have this idea where I'm gonna put this thing on paper, and if people get it and if they like it, then great, and if they don't, well, they're rejecting me, and this isn't for them. It turns into a masturbatory self-worship. Like, I'm putting myself out there, and if you don't like it, then this isn't for you. Maybe we need to look more at let's make it more accessible. If someone doesn't understand it, okay, well, maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I need to fix what I'm doing. Okay, so find someone that you trust and say, hey, what do you think about this? Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? And if they don't, then maybe that's not their fault. Maybe that's my fault. So when we take things like thoughts about war and thoughts about transition, and we put them on paper, why don't we put them into a craft like rhyme, like meter, which is soothing to the mind and helps the mind like tie it together. And why don't we do that so that maybe the reader's able to understand it better?
Right. Like, art at the end of the day it's really just technology. It's a tool, right? That we're using to pursue the good, the true, and the beautiful. Right. And I love the perspective that you're bringing, which is, it's really easy for those of us that believe in objective standards, across space and time. But let's just talk about art for now. For those of us that believe in objective standards in art, it's really easy for us to say, well, that's just, postmodern nonsense to say that you're reading into my poem or my essay or my film or my painting or my sculpture, your own worldview onto it, right? Or your own thoughts or your own experience. But what I haven't heard said, at least in a while, is what you just said, which is the responsibility then comes back onto the practitioner, the artist, to say, well, maybe I'm the problem here. If they don't understand it as well as they could, maybe I'm not saying what's good and what's true and what's beautiful as best as I can with the tools that I've been given.
Yes, and one thing that drives me insane is when somebody will write poetry, or they'll make a work of art, and they'll you say, hey, what's this about? What's going through your mind? And they say, well, what do you think it's about? No, you don't do that. Don't put the burden on the observer or onto the reader to carry their own meaning into it. We're talking about an eisegesis. No, let's get exegetical with this. Did you have something in mind when you wrote that? No? Okay, well, then it's just meaningless words. All you did was write a whole bunch of garbage, hit enter a few times to make it into a stanza, and then call that a poem, which, let's be honest, I've done that. 100%. But let's as writers, let's stop putting the burden onto the reader of meaning. Like, they got to carry their own stuff into this. No, you give them something and then supply meaning to it. And then maybe if you do a good job and tie it together, that they'll get that.
And they're absolutely allowed to bring their own experiences, their own view, and their own sense of meaning to bear on the piece. It's just it's now volleying back and forth as we're trying to find as close to the center as we possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I would hope that if someone were to ask me about one of my poems or one of the things that I wrote, hey, what were you thinking? What's this about? I could say, well, it's about this, this, and this. 100%. That's what it's about. And did you get that? No? Okay, well, that's my bad.
Right. Well, it's back to the idea that you were talking about with iambic and trochaic and all these other, haiku and all these other ways to write poem. That
haiku
is
haikus.
Yeah. Haikus are fun. Those are the ones I remember the most from grade school. And I definitely want to get kind of back into some of those. But that idea of creative constraint, right? Like to your point, if it's just free verse and it's just vomiting words onto a page, there's no creative constraint there. We need those constraints, those objective standards with which you need to execute a haiku or iambic pentameter in order to then take everything that's in your head and you're putting it into a set of standards that either work or don't work. And if you can't take what's in your head and drop it into that particular sandbox or those different sandboxes throughout an entire manuscript, well, then you're the one who needs to do the work within those different constraints.
Yeah, and I hope that I should communicate this. Anybody who's done free verse, it's not because you're a bad poet. Walt Whitman is one of the greatest ever to ever do that. There's some great free verse writers out there. Obviously I talk about Leo Jenkins is fantastic at this. But guys like Walt Whitman and Leo Jenkins, they can do the rhyme and the meter and stuff too. Like, "Oh, Captain, My Captain" is Walt Whitman's most famous poem. And it's rhyme and meter. The rest of his stuff, "Song of Myself," poems like that, "Leaves of Grass," a lot of that's just, free verse. And he's really, really good at it. And yeah, so there's poets out there, with Dead Reckoning as well, that do a lot of free verse, and it's not because they're bad poets by any means. But I'm saying, like, if all we do is the bare minimum, try to put some craftsmanship into it. Let's do some editing into it as well. If that makes sense.
Yes. No, it totally makes sense. And I would like to echo your sentiments and be on the record and be clear that free verse is absolutely a valid way to write poetry and to communicate thoughts.
I think it's harder to do well. I think that verse and meter and rhyme are basics. Like that's kind of what I'm doing with my next book is I'm trying to go back to basics. Can I master this? And then maybe I can go back to free verse.
Right. It's all about, like you said, craftsmanship, right? Like this is a craft. It is not something that you absolutely can do it just for fun. You can do it for self-expression. You can do it to get those thoughts onto the page, to organize them. But in order to be great, to be good, or to be great, or to be elite, or to put something out there that people are going to then be reflected on, right? Like it requires craft.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into where they meet. So the process from the first anthology to now your journey, understanding this craft, working this craft, trying to figure out like how best to do this. Where was the manuscript for where they meet born, and how did you think about organizing all of these poems into a cohesive manuscript?
So I started writing off for the anthology, and if you look at the first one, Dead Reckoning's first one, I had a couple poems in there, and they were with rhyme and meter. So I started with that, and all these were on deployment. So I was contracting at the time, and I spent a lot of time, driving around, third world countries or whatever, just thinking about these things. Like, well, if I did that, I wonder if I can do this. And if I did that, I wonder if I could do this. And that turned into war is such an inherently poetic concept, I think, because a lot of poems are about war. It's just the farthest extent of the human experience. It's one of the most violent thing. It is the most violent thing we could possibly do. And so there's you can write a lot about that. There's different kinds of feelings, different kinds of smells, emotions, all that stuff that it's just inherently poetic. So a lot of the songs are about war, but then as a husband and a father, being a husband and a father is also inherently poetic. And I found a lot of my writing was centering on the emotions of being a father or loving a woman for, umpteen years. And those things were very far apart from the poems about war. But sometimes those two things clash together as far as you bring those experiences of war home to your family. And how does that affect your family? Well, that's where they meet. That's where the idea came from. So I started, as I was organizing these poems, I started noticing that those are the three themes, war, peace, family and home. And then where those two things clash together. And then obviously, as a Christian, a lot of those thoughts about Christ and salvation and God being present in all of those areas bleeds into it as well.
Did you write these sections in order and the poems in order in them, or were you jumping around?
I jumped around, so my brain is very thematic during this. So I would have an idea like, well, what about, wait, I got a poem about my daughter looking at a picture of my team, and some of the faces were blurred out for some reason. She's like asking why these were blurred out, and I was explaining it to her, and so I got a poem about that. Or I got a poem called "Dead Bodies," where I'm, waxing eloquent, so to speak, about this dead body and why it looks the way it does. And that one's kind of that one was interesting because the thoughts that are going through my head, I've got stanzas about the thoughts that I'm looking at this body, and I'm looking at why it looks different than a living one. Because if you've ever seen a dead body, it looks vastly different from a living one. And then it switches from those thoughts to the actual combat that's zooming around my head, the bullets snapping by or whatever, trying to get radio calls to get that medevac in, all that kind of stuff. And so the thoughts in my head were in iambic, and the actual battle scenes were in trochaic because of that that earlier poetic device. But yeah, so I just kind of bounced around, like, what can I write about today? And then would write that, and then later I was like, oh, well, I've noticed these three themes, and that's where the title came from.
And then in terms of organizing them into the sections, like when did you start? When did you, that thought you just described, that you noticed those three sections, those three different themes? How far into the collection were you when you noticed that, and when did you start to organize them that way? And did that affect the writing you continued to do on the manuscript?
Probably about 3/4 of the way through it, I started noticing, well, I've got enough for a book here. I wonder if I could do that. And so I started organizing them that way, and then that turned into the last quarter of it was based on that. So I had already written a book that I was going to publish, and I was working with it, and it was okay. It was an action novel, just about contractors. That's the life I know, and it wasn't really going anywhere. So I switched to the poetry, and once I figured out I had enough for a book, that's what happened.
It's interesting. Say more about that. Like, what a lot of times as writers, as creators, as makers, we I talked about it earlier, right? Like the notes that I have on my phone, those three sentences, they might be something, they might not be something. I'm going to go through that process to discover that, right? As I continue to flesh that out and see if it's something. And I've gotten to a spot in my writing where if it is something, great, I'll blow it out and keep going. If it's not, I don't judge myself for it. I'm like, cool, that was a good idea, a good rep. I got that in, and I'm gonna dispense with it and move on to something else. But what was that feeling like for you to I don't want to put words in your mouth or make it sound some way, but to abandon that book and then move on to this one, to that piece that you were making? Like, how did that feel? How did you process that? Was it easy?
I think it's harder when you first start, because when you first start, every piece of everything that you create, you're attached to. And just like any writer, or I think most writers are like this, and I think artists are like this. Like, what's the last thing I created? Well, that's the thing I'm most excited about. So the last thing you made was like you're real super excited about it, and you're happy about it. And then at some point, like as you develop as a writer or as an artist, you might look at it and say, that was just like you said, that was a good rep. Maybe that doesn't really have what it takes to be out in the world. And I think as you write more and as you exercise that creative muscle, you start to be more okay with getting rid of other stuff. So like my next book is going to be much shorter. My first book, Where They Meet, I had a lot of poems in there that maybe I wouldn't put in there now. My next book will be shorter because there's a lot of stuff that just got left on the, I guess you would call it the editing room floor in the brain. But yeah, I've trashed an entire novel before. Spent a year or so working on that, and I just kind of threw it in the garbage. I just don't think it's good enough. You know what I mean?
What are the reference points you use to make that decision, to make that determination? What are the standards that you're looking at to say this is good enough, I want to continue and put it out, or this isn't, I'm going to walk away from it?
I sit on it for a while, and then if I come back to it, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's good. Then I'll keep it. If it's like, there's a bit of a cringe factor there. Okay, if it's cringy, yeah, maybe I don't keep it. The novel was just a lot of action and a lot of blood and stuff and things like that, which is it's all well and good. There's guys that are really good at that, but I just didn't think looking back after like a couple of years that I just didn't think it had what it take when I went back to it.
Yeah, it's funny. At the last week of film school, my last week of film school, I spent those 7 days writing a feature-length screenplay. Right, and I did well in film school. I'd had some flash fiction published during film school. I had written 2 short screenplays, one of which had won some awards through some screenplay and film festival competitions. I knew I was going to take those out to LA and turn them into films and actually produce them and direct them and take what was on the page and put them on the screen. But the one thing that I hadn't done in the program was write a feature-length screenplay. And so I took 7 days. The last class is a portfolio class, and my portfolio was like pretty well organized already because I was being a military student, right? I was ready to get out into the world and use my education and turn it into a craft and actually work. And so my portfolio was like pretty well set, and the website and everything was like really good. So I had that last week was a little bit of downtime, and one of my film professors had an opportunity. There was somebody who wanted a screenplay, and they're like, "Hey, can you write this?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." So they had like a log line for it. And I'm like, "Oh, that sounds interesting." So I took that log line and I blew it out into an 86-page screenplay over the course of a week. And I kind of got into that fugue state, right, where I was just writing, didn't judge any of the words that were on the page. I just wrote the whole thing, and I finished it and I read it, and I'm like, "Oh man, that's actually pretty good." So I sent it off, and whatever. Didn't hear anything back. Did a few years in my career, and then I went back to it last year and I read it from the first page, and I was both horrified at how terrible some of the things were, and I was really excited about some of the great writing that was in there. And it was like almost an out of body experience, because an older self who had worked in the industry and had produced screenplays and had actually done this work and seen these things come to life, I looked back with more of a producer's eye and less of a writer's eye. And I was like, man, if I was editing this writer, if I was producing this writer, there was about 1/3 of that stuff that was really, really good. And I would say blow that out. And there was 2/3 of it that was really, really bad. And I would say dispense with it. And ultimately, I'm not going to finish that screenplay. I'm not going to do that with that story. But it really does help me as I write more for the screen, to have had that experience of A, finishing a manuscript that big, and B, looking back and being able to have both an objective and a subjective eye for, hey, some of this is good, some of this is really bad. And I didn't judge myself for it. I just looked at it and say, oh, that's where you were at that time. Take it, use it, and move forward.
Yeah. Give it some time, and then look back at it. Your own maturation will tend to be a very good editing process in and of itself, even without guys like Tyler and Keith looking over your stuff and saying, hey, this is good, this is not. You can still just your own person figure out what's good and what's not.
Yeah. So as you mentioned already that the next manuscript is going to be shorter, how much of that is actual pieces that you've gone back and rewritten or edited that were in fact on that editing room floor? How much of it is new? And what are you taking along those lines? What are you taking from this experience, this process, this manuscript, what you've learned, what you've matured as a writer and as a person, and taking into the next one?
So a vast majority of this will be rhyme and meter, but it's not just A-B, rhyme and meter. What I took from the first book that's going to the second is that the rhyme and meter, but more of a playing with the different types of rhyme and meter. So sonnets, for instance, we tend to write when we write with rhyme and meter, we tend to write da 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 da. So that's 4 feet. Going to iambic pentameter is a little more difficult because now you've got 5 accent syllables. And iambic pentameter is the basic form of the sonnet, which is very, very well-known form of poetry. It's done by William Shakespeare and a bunch of other people. So then my next book is just kind of playing around with different forms. It's like I've got a lot of sonnets. Some of them are Elizabethan. Some of them are the the Italian, the Petrarchan sonnets, just kind of playing around with those ideas and those forms. And I think you can do that as a writer. You can look at, hey, how did this guy do this? And he made this type of poem, a sonnet, for instance. That I would like to try that. Or if you look at G.K. Chesterton, he has a very, very distinct meter form along with his rhyme that works really, really well. So just I was just kind of playing around with that. And I've got some free verse stuff in there, but I was trying to be more careful with the free verse than I was last time. So really trying to, because poetry and prose are different in that prose is more like a loaf of bread. There's a lot going on here. Poetry is more condensing that experience into a slice of it. So instead of a loaf of bread or maybe a glass of beer, more like a shot of whiskey. So trying to condense meaning into a smaller form and have every word matter. Or if you ever talk to like stand-up comics or listen to them talk, they're trying to what they call trim the fat. There's no fat on a joke if it's got no meaningless words. Every word matters in that joke. That way it's just packed with it.
Yeah, this back to the idea, right? Like one of the things I really enjoy about stand-up comedy is going to local clubs, right? Like I'm here in Columbus. We've got one, all the different cities I've lived in. I've always gone and watched stand-up comedy. And one of the most interesting, fascinating, and exciting things is to watch. It's back to the muscle analogy, right? To watch them work out, like to watch them train, to watch them discover where that fat is, what's working, what's not working, and to watch them process that in real time as they're performing, as they're executing the craft. And then you go watch the special on Netflix or Hulu or wherever it is, and you see where the fat got trimmed, where that joke that you experienced is similar and where it might be different. But then you look at it in its fully finished and polished form, and you see the entire process, and it makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah, so I got a buddy that does stand-up comedy, and he was talking about he goes to comedy shows all the time. And he talked about Jim Gaffigan does this, where he'll have a lot of old jokes, and he'll do that. He'll do a set with a bunch of old jokes, and then he'll throw in a few new ones. And he's testing the waters. And then his next show, he'll throw in a few more, or he'll change those other new jokes slightly to see which gets more of a laugh. And he's recording the entire time, and he's analyzing which way when I said this word, did I get more of a laugh than when I said this word? Was my timing good? Maybe I need a longer pause between the setup and the delivery? So he's analyzing all these things, and it's very much a craft. Then eventually, by the time he gets to a special, he's done that enough to where he has an entire set of new jokes that worked well with an audience.
Yeah. And this is full circle, right? It's back to that creation and consumption, right? Like clearly talking to you consume more than just poetry. You've gone very deep in poetry, right? You have an understanding of all of these different forms, and that's the medium with which you're writing and you're publishing, but you're consuming all of these different things. We've referenced stand-up comedy and film and novels and all of these different media, right? And so this idea that you just need to go a mile deep in one thing, whatever your craft is, like that is true. But what's also true is having that mile wide understanding of the artistic landscape of where you can pull different ideas, where you can pull different disciplines from, not just the one that you're executing.
Yeah. And you can read different poets like, I got my stack here of all these guys, like William Holliard from he wrote Soberman's Thoughts. You can read his stuff, and you can see, okay, this guy was probably reading a lot of these guys. And you look at someone like Amy Sexauer, wrote Poppies, and you can say, oh, she's probably reading a lot of these things. And you read my stuff, and obviously I'm reading, I'm a bit of an Anglophile, so G.K. Chesterton, Rudyard Kipling, and things like that. But yeah, you can look at all these guys and you can say, hey, this is probably where their influence comes from.
Yeah, it's great. I love it. That's a great point about the collection within the Dead Reckoning Collective of, and me being in a position, having talked to all of you and interviewed all of you about the different works, like you really start to map strategically and relationally what people are consuming, what their influences are, and then how they start to influence you and how you start to influence them. And that community aspect, that relational aspect of this particular art form is quite beautiful.
And they're so vastly different as well. So you got like you got like the two posts that I mentioned. You got your David Roses, you got your Matt Smythes and things like that. And if you all get together, like we're completely different people. Some are really into the experience, like William Howard likes to talk about, the alcohol, the being in bars and things like that. Amy Sexauer's got a lot of deployment stuff. She's got a really funny poem called "Places I've Peed," stuff like that. And then my poetry, obviously I'm a family man, so I'm focused on that kind of thing. And I'm politically I'm slightly to the left of Charlemagne, I guess, and we all clash there. But yeah, there's you can definitely tell where our influences have come from and how that has shaped us as writers, and our experiences have as well.
And what's particularly beautiful about it is how all of those different perspectives converge and start to form this community, right? Like this pocket of the veteran community, of the military community around literature and expression, writing and meaning.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably as great a place as any to wrap things up. Cokie, where can folks find you? Where can folks find your writing? Where would you like to drive traffic?
So I'm pretty much just on Instagram. I think I have a Facebook page, but I don't play around there very much. Yeah, Cokie Actual, which is a strange name. I know. I don't actually like it anymore. When I came up with it, I was working for some people that don't like a lot of, or that prefer to be anonymous, and so I had to have a nom de plume, so to speak. And so for some reason, I picked Cokie, and I don't like it anymore. But that's all people know me as. No one knows who Nate Coffee is, But yeah, at Cokie Actual on Instagram, that's pretty much where everything's at. And then I have a book with Dead Reckoning Collective, and I got some work in their other anthologies as well.
Yeah, great. Well, yeah, we'll link all that stuff in the show notes. As you know, I post all of these pieces of content and reels and different things on Instagram. So I'll tag you and we'll collaborate on those posts and share it far and wide within the community. To end each episode, Nate, I ask an open-ended question. What's on your heart and your mind for our community right now? Could be a piece of advice, something you want to get off your chest, or something you want to reiterate that we've already talked about today. But Nate, what's on your heart? What's on your mind?
I think that you mentioned three things in a row that were, I think, something that we need to focus on. We talked about objective beauty, and you said truth, beauty, and goodness. Let's bring that into the world. I tend to focus on, I'd like to focus on, fatherhood and marriage as wonderful things, and lifting those things up, and faith in God and how that shapes us as human beings. Let's put that into the world. I think that we don't need negativity as much, or glorifying dumpster fires as much as we need looking at and thinking about things that are true, good, and beautiful. Just stuff about nature, or things about God, Christ, salvation. Children are wonderful. Let's write about them. Let's write about being married. Let's write about how good those things are or can be.
Well said. Well, Nate, appreciate your time, appreciate your energy, appreciate your work, appreciate your words. Looking forward to reading the next one, and we'll have you back to talk about that one as well.
Awesome. Thanks for putting things out there and helping out the community.
Cheers, brother. We'll see you.
All right.